Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025, episode 427, and we're going to talk about Zohran Mamdani. This episode is an answer to a question I saw on the YouTube channel where someone asked what I thought about uh, Mamdani. So I did a little research, particularly just went on his website and decided to just use his platform as a basis for this episode. And I'll comment on some of his other comments that other people keep going on about, but which is why the second part of the title, what is the racialization we should be concerned about? All right, so I've heard stuff about him. People spoke about him. There is a Mises Media YouTube video, um, New York Socialists, Powell Attacks, and the 12 Days War. In that episode, it's kind of interesting how a lot of people, they bring up the issue that a lot of people want to talk about some religious remarks that he had made a while ago, but he hasn't made those kinds of remarks since. And obviously, if he were to make them today, I don't think he would have gotten as many votes as he did. But it's not his religion, it's his politics, it's the economics that seem to me anyway, that matter. The fact that he made some inflammatory comments in the past, I think, is less of an issue because he's not going to be elected on those issues. He's going to get elected by the economic things that he's saying. And if you look at his website, he's not talking about religion, Sharia law, or any of these things um, at all. Anyway, uh, they bring up the fact that Mamdani's father was a part of a CIA operation where you go into African countries. I forget which country he is from originally. Let me see if I have it right here. Yeah, his father was originally from Uganda, and basically the CIA tried to have regime change there too. And the way they would do that, it was they would bring some promising people to America, educate them, and send them back to their country to basically lead their country to become more like America. But of course, educate them means sending them to top universities here in the United States where Marxism reigned supreme and still reigns supreme. And so basically, they brought the CIA, the US government brought people from all over the world, taught them how to be Marxists and communists, and then sent them back to their country and then wondered why they are all advocating for communism. Well, that was Mamdani's father. And so Mamdani, of course, being raised in that situation, already primed to embrace communistic Marxist ideas, then goes to a liberal school, Bowdoin, and then basically becomes even more radical. And so he calls himself a democratic socialist, which is basically a more polite way of saying communist, right? And so most of his support for the election came from college-educated whites and Asians, whether they're South Asians, East Asians, it doesn't really matter. That's the category that's being cited. His support comes from college-educated whites and Asians who generally tend to be college-educated. Right. And so, in other words, although he's carrying a Marxist message, his support is not coming from the lower classes. In other words, he tries to make it really obvious that he's trying to fight for the lower classes, and the majority of the lower classes, like 60 to 70%, do not want that, do not want his interference into their lives. The Democrats, the establishment Democrats, for their part, they tried to make the election about Israel, of all things, right? But then most people are like, well, what does that have to do with America? What does that have to do with New York City? Plus, Cuomo, who was the establishment candidate uh, is probably trying to make sure that everyone forgets about all of the things that the horrible, horrible things he did during the Cervasis lockdowns, right? He sent Cervasis positive people into the nursing homes, which resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. It happened in Pennsylvania as well. Um, but so how do you, after you basically are responsible for the murder of so many people, how do you do well as a candidate? I don't know. Maybe if you didn't have a loved one that died as a result of that policy, maybe you really don't care. But it's interesting that Mamdani basically won with a more pure democratic message. In other words, he basically, his message is what a lot of the Democratic platform is all about: rent control, raising the minimum wage, things like this. And so, how do you oppose it when that is actually part of your party? And I guess Cuomo's strategy was to talk about Israel, and Mamdani is obviously Muslim. And so, therefore, do you want a Muslim as your mayor, or do you want a Jew? Someone who is very pro-Israel as your mayor. You know, that seems to be how they map their strategy. So the Mises Wire had a short article called "The Establishment Democrats Created the Conditions for a Socialist Victory" by Connor O'Keefe. A couple of interesting things that he said in that article was that New York City is bigger than 39 states of the United States, which is, wow, I did not know that. I didn't realize the states were that small, but apparently they are. So the Democratic strategy after the election of Trump is to basically embrace socialism. And Mamdani is a democratic socialist, right? Basically a communist. And in case you were wondering, I've said it before that the way that I make things easier to understand, simplify things to make it easier to sort of get your head around certain ideas. Um, you have socialism, which is basically spreading liability across a lot of people, making many people responsible for certain things and erasing the individual. So the extreme opposite is the individual. Anything that is less than pro and focused on the individual is, in my mind, socialistic. And so how socialistic you are, how more extreme you are, is about splitting hairs, really. In my mind, I don't see a big difference, right? So the establishment Democrats want a slow takeover of the United States with socialism, rewarding themselves and their cronies as they go along the way. And then you have radical democratic socialism, communism, which basically says, let's do it now. You know, why wait? And so that totally messes up the system that the Democrats have been plundering the country with. The Republicans too, I'll say. But since Mamdani is a Democrat, and so socialism also is brought and introduced and slowly, um, you know, basically becomes the default position of Americans through virtue signaling, right? So you basically say, oh, we got to help the poor. Well, how do you help the poor? Well, the government has to do this, right? All the government just has to do this, and the poor will be taken care of, right? And so this virtue signaling process, the solution is always bigger government, which is socialism. That is the medium through which, or the way that socialism basically comes to power in uh, supposedly free societies like the United States. So his campaign message was that the cost of living is too high. So Connor O'Keefe says that it's an island. New York City is an island, which means that space is limited. And so costs will always generally be higher than in other places, particularly in rural areas. But the Democratic government itself, that has been in control of New York City, has also forced prices higher. And this is a quote from his article. Most people can tell that the high cost of living we're facing today is not due to some natural disaster or recent material constraint, but is a byproduct of unnecessary policies. All Zoran had to do to win was run a campaign that spoke to that sentiment, prioritized it, and presented solutions that sounded different enough from the usual buzzwords and hollow promises the New York establishment has been repeating for decades. So, end quote. Establishment Democrats can't stop it because basically, as I said, this is their own message, and they have always ignored the negative criticisms from Republicans and people like me, anarcho-capitalists, who say, "Oh no, no, that policy has a lot of problems." Like the anti-eviction legislation, right? And so what you saw was Democrats selling their soul for short-term gain. Now they're being smacked in the face by someone who won't play the game that establishment Democrats have been playing, but basically says, "Oh, why have all this pretense? Let's just do it." Right? And obviously Democrats don't want that in general. And so establishment Democrats as a whole have denied the problems of education, uh, police, property, transportation. Okay. And so now we have Mamdani as the winner of the Democratic primary election, which means that he's going to be the next mayor, right? Because Republicans barely make a showing in these things. There's another Mises Wire article called Will New York City Become the New Socialist Paradise? And this is by William Anderson. A couple of things to highlight there is that he says socialism fails in the real world, but it does well in American electoral politics, which is, I think, extremely funny, sad, but still funny. The disconnect is that socialism claims to help the poor, but his support, Mamdani's support, is not from the poor, but rather is from the wealthy. And it's because the wealthy won't have to pay for it, and neither will they be affected by any of the policies that are on Mamdani's platform. So Mamdani's platform targets the poor, but they don't want it, right? So things like triple the city's production of affordable homes, but in order to pay for it, you have to raise taxes. Oh, okay. So who votes for raising taxes? Well, people who don't pay taxes, right? And here's a quote: "In modern politics, there is no greater form of virtue signaling than voting for a socialist, even if one is not stuck with the bill," right? And so obviously people who vote for this are not going to pay for it. They're not going to be affected all that much by these policies. It's like there was a proposal in the township next to me where they wanted to build a brand new elementary school. And people opposed it and people were in favor of it. And the people who opposed it said, "Hey, if this passes, then certain people are going to pay 20% more in taxes." Right? Okay, well, who would vote for that? Yeah, people who are not going to have a 20% increase in their taxes, right? And so there are many more people who are in that situation. And so the initiative passed. And so now you're going to see a new elementary school, but a lot of people's taxes are going to go higher. Well, what happens when people's taxes go higher? And Anderson goes on and says there's a 2023 New York Post article where they talk about how 56 firms moved from New York to Florida because of the increase in taxes because of the whole Cervasis thing. And still more, in addition to the 56, moved to Texas and North and South Carolina. So basically, economic calculation is the problem for socialists in general. Anderson says, economic calculation is kryptonite to socialism, right? Once you actually start doing math, socialism falls apart. That is trying to figure out what the price should be, right? What should the correct price of a product or a service should be? And socialism cannot figure it out because it's a top-down system where the government determines what the price is. And if it deviates, if it's not close to what the actual price should be, then you see all kinds of weird things happening throughout the economy. All right. So in conclusion, these are my thoughts. That's his platform as the way I understand it. Keeping in mind that his religious remarks didn't really play a part in his election. It's his platform, right? And I know a lot of people try to use those remarks, sort of jihadist kind of stuff, to try to slander him. But I don't think that really was it. No one really cares about that cultural aspect. It's sort of like looking at Trump and calling him Hitler, right? Well, it's the same thing. You look at Mamdani and basically say he's a jihadist, and yeah, it's not going to fly, right? So it's the economics that is important. So his racialization or his categorization is socialist, not Muslim. I mean, no one cares about his religion, okay, which is good. And if he, I think if he did make Islam a big part of his platform, he would have gotten fewer votes. He might have still been elected because his opponent was Cuomo, for crying out loud. Anyway, but his racialization, or the category that is important, is socialist. And I've talked about racialization. Race in this channel is a generalization based on a single characteristic. Most people will use skin color, but that's just one of infinite number of characteristics that each of us have at any given moment. And so the one that is significant and that is concerning for us in this episode is the socialist, the democratic socialism, right? So he's radical socialist versus the establishment slow burn crony socialist, as I've been describing before. If you go to his website, Zohran for New York City, NYC.com, he says very prominently on the top, cost of living is the problem. The goal is to lower the cost of living for working class New Yorkers. Well, obviously, it's not for New York working class New Yorkers. They rejected that. And in order to carry this out, he wants rent control, right? He wants rent control on the 2 million units, housing units that are in New York City, and he wants to build more. He wants to eliminate bus fare. He wants to raise childcare workers' salaries. He wants the minimum wage to go to $30 per hour. He also wants free childcare up to age 6, on top of raising the wages of the workers who work at those childcare facilities. Also, he talks about cracking down on bad landlords, and this is in the context of the no eviction legislation that had been passed. In other words, like most socialists, he's extremely superficial. He doesn't talk about where the money is going to come from to pay for all of this stuff, right? I mean, they claim they're going to raise taxes, okay? But let's focus on the fact that they are superficial. So he's saying, oh, look, we have bad landlords. He doesn't say, why are there bad landlords? He says, why child health care is so expensive. He doesn't ask, why is it so expensive? Rent, why is it so high? Right? He doesn't ask why. He just says, look, rent is too high. We have to fix this problem. And the easy solution is build more, rental units, as if no one else had proposed this ever before. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just, and it's so stupid too, because it's like everyone who's voting, unless you're really, really young and you haven't voted at another election, a previous election, but this is what everyone says. Do you remember there was that one dude where he wore gloves? He was African American. He says the rent is too damn high, right? I mean, come on. It's like they always say this and they always propose the same solutions and it never works, right? And so it's that same superficial analysis and then over simplistic, naive solution, right? No one is looking at root cause, the origin or the source of these problems, and no one wants to, because of course all of this, the answer is always the same. It's government meddling, it's government interference into our everyday lives, which have created all of these problems. And instead of rolling back all of the previous government meddling, no, everyone's going to double down. And that's because every time you have a new legislation, you have special interest groups who are going to profit from that system. And to change the system means that they lose all their money, which I don't care. But since they control the levers of government, they don't like it. It ain't going to happen. We don't even talk about it. Right. And so Mamdani's platform, like so many other socialistic platforms, basically preserves the fundamental disease of that city and then turns around and feeds the disease to make it worse. Right. So take housing, for example. Why is housing so expensive? Well, because of zoning regulations, right? It has to be made this way, to these specifications. And when you build a new apartment, you also have to build free housing for homeless people, right? And yes, that is in fact what happens. And so the cost of building something goes through the roof because of all the requirements that are put on there, right? Then you got these building regulations, you got to get permits, you have to use union labor, which is extremely expensive, right? You have to get the licenses, the proper licenses to do all of this stuff. And it's years and years of work to do this, right? And all of this drives up the cost of the building, right? And so by imposing rent control, people can't charge what they need to charge to make it profitable to have that business, okay? Especially if you're going to use the same building methods that you have been all this time, which you have to because of all the unions, right? That are basically saying, no, hey, we got to protect our jobs. And in order to protect our jobs, you have to force people to build in certain ways. Having rent control means that you will have fewer units built and the cost of non-rent control units skyrocket, right? Because there's no competition for lower cost, better, more modern units. And so even the existing ones, even if they're junk, right? Even if they're a dump, I mean, they get to charge like millions of dollars, for people to live there. I've talked about fast building in China. In fact, I talked about that tunnel a couple episodes ago, the underwater tunnel, 16-lane underwater tunnel. But if you were to employ fast building in New York City, what happens? Not only are construction workers going to lose their jobs, right, because they're not needed any longer, perhaps, maybe not. I think their jobs would be fine, but a lot of people see it as a threat because they have to learn new skills. But think of all the people who invested in real estate, right? The cost of real estate is just going to go into the basement, which means all those people who have invested all that money into real estate, they lose big. So everywhere you look in a problem such as housing, there's a problem, right? There's a special interest group there waiting to jump all over you if you propose a real solution, so you can't even talk about it. And so instead, you just make empty promises, right? How about free buses? Well, the average uh, public transportation employee makes over $90,000 per year, right? But at least you had bus fares to sort of offset their salaries, but now you don't even have that revenue because riding a bus is free. And so basically you have to raise taxes. Free childcare while raising the pay of childcare workers? Yeah, again, got to raise the taxes. Bad landlords, look, if you own a property, you want to fix the property. It's their property. But where do you get the money to fix all of it if there's no rent collection, right? No eviction moratorium. Why did you want to evict those people? Because they were either destroying your property or they weren't paying rent. And so now no one's paying rent and you still have to fix the property. Yeah, that ain't happening. Right. So you see, if you just look at the superficial, you never actually get at the root of the problem, the root cause. So all of these problems are government caused. If someone charges, and you know, um, if we had the free market in place, right? If we had more freedom, well, if someone charges too much, then everyone just simply buys from someone else. And this forces the first business to either lower their prices or go out of business or cater to a wealthier demographic. Is something unsafe? Don't buy it. And so whoever is making it or producing it or selling it or offering it has to make it safer. How do you know something can be safer? Because other people are making it safer, right? They'll advertise, they'll say, this is much safer, right? And the buyers will say, hey, that's much safer, right? So freedom is the answer, not a know-it-all socialist. A know-it-all socialist is no different than you or me looking at a problem, focusing on virtue signaling and saying, all we got to do is this. It's like a commercial I saw a long time ago where firemen are now in charge of Congress, right? And so the fireman who's now the Speaker of the House, he says, hey, who wants cleaner water? All those in favor say aye. And everyone says, yeah, I want clean water. And everyone says aye. He goes, okay, done. We have clean water. Okay, how about safer homes? Who wants safer homes? All those in favor say aye. Everyone says aye. Okay, fine, right? This is a little more simplistic than what's actually happening, but it's still the same thing. How do you get cleaner water? How are you going to get safer homes? You see? And it's the Soviet Union problem, right? The Soviet Union, the government there, and I talked about this before, they had millions and millions of prices they had to determine for the entire country. And they can't. You just simply can't do that because all of the prices have to work against all of the other prices, right? And so you change one price and it causes ripples throughout the economy and it messes everything up. And so the general tendency is that you don't change the prices. And so incentives are all messed up and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, one person cannot know it all, certainly not a democratic socialist in a city that is larger than 39 states of the union. That person does not know all of the solutions for all of the problems of everyone who lives in New York City. A couple of days ago, I talked about that meme where it says, who wants free stuff? And everyone raises their hands. And it says, who wants to pay for all the free stuff? I changed it a little bit. Who wants to pay for other people's free stuff? Which basically means who wants to pay for all the free stuff? And no one raises their hand. And that's what Mamdani is promising. He's promising more free stuff, lower cost stuff, right, with no cost, right? Someone else is going to pay for it. Obviously, you're going to have to raise taxes. And the problem with that is, of course, the people who can, they are going to move out of the city, depriving the city of that revenue, which drives the taxes even higher, which kills the city even faster. Freedom with responsibility brings down the cost of living. It forces corporations, landowners, even citizens to do their work well or lose in the marketplace, right? And in New York City, this socialistic mindset has been in place for so long that a lot of people are going to lose big time. But that was the risk, right? If you are going to buy $6 million with a studio apartment, right? Well, the risk is that the price of that real estate is going to collapse, and now you're looking at $200,000, right? That was the risk. That's why you bought it in the first place. And it's sort of like Uber and Lyft. Taxi licenses also were much in the same way. It was like what, $1 million per license. Then Uber and Lyft came in, and those taxi licenses are, you know, they're definitely not worth $1 million any longer. And and so there it is, right? You either pay now or you pay much, much bigger later. So Mamdani, they sound good, the promises that he makes, but of course they're all failed ideas. We know they already are going to fail. How they're going to fail and how fast they're going to fail that's all we need to wait and see. But otherwise, they are failed ideas. And hopefully, more American people remember that freedom is the answer, not this socialism stuff. But hope that answers the question, and I'll talk to you next time.